The United States Special Forces have long operated in the shadows of the Middle East, and now, after decades of war, these Black Ops are finally coming to light. From the global war on terror all the way to the chaos unfolding today, this will be an iceberg-style video where I've picked out a bunch of stories and missions that I think Hollywood hasn't covered. To set the stage, allow me to introduce you to the U.S. Special Forces 5th Group. They cut their teeth in the jungles of Vietnam, where they were the absolute daddies of unconventional warfare. By the 1980s, they were reassigned to U.S. Central Command, giving them a new focus on the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia. Things changed big time in 1987. That's when Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, was created, and it was given a 4-star general at the helm. So for the first time, units like 5th Group had real clout. They were given their own budget, and they had a permanent seat at the decision-makers' table, just in time, because the wars in the new area of operation were about to kick off, and not slow down for decades. Our first story is about the little-known combat between U.S. Special Forces and Iranian operatives inside Iraq. By 2007, evidence recovered in the field by troops revealed that Iran was directly supporting insurgent forces as a proxy against America. In response to the reports, President George W. Bush authorized the controversial kill or capture strategy against any Iranian agents suspected of aiding insurgent forces. But before we get into that, a quick message from today's sponsor, Delete Me.
If you're like my dad, Johnny Cappy, then you absolutely hate having your information being online.
Absolutely. It's scary.
And that's why I got my dad a Delete Me account, because they ran a privacy report on him and were able to delete 178 personal pieces of information. A ton of listings were removed.
After looking at my Delete Me report, I realized why I get so much spam. I mean, these data brokers have my phone number, address.
The amount of time that it saved you was 4.5 hours time searching, and then another 4.5 hours time removing these.
Way more than that.
My dad raised our family to be careful about data our entire lives.
I remember we used to go to the grocery store and they would ask for your number and you would say 555 555 555.
I try not to give them really anything. The FBI still has all the information on me. There's nothing I can do about that.
Get Delete Me for yourself. Get it as a gift for your dad.
If you want your data deleted forever, just go to joindeleteme.com/CappyArmy and use my promo code CAPPY for 20% off. Within hours of President Bush's public announcement in January 2007, troops from Delta Force raided an Iranian consulate in the northern Iraqi city of Erbil, which is kind of like their embassy. The operation was aimed at capturing and questioning Mohammad Jafari, who was the deputy head of Iran's Security Council, and General Forzadi, the intelligence chief of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Unfortunately, neither of the targets was present at the consulate, but the raid did nab 5 mid-level Revolutionary Guard officers that were nicknamed the Erbil 5. The raid cost tons of political capital with the Iraqi government, but it showed how far America was willing to go against their Iranian targets. This was the start of a new phase in the shadow war between the United States and Iran that really extends all the way to today. A senior U.S. counterterrorism official spoke anonymously to the Washington Post, and he characterized this wider goal, this aggressive strategy of murking Iranian agents inside Iraq, saying, quote, "Our goal is to change the dynamic with the Iranians, to change the way the Iranians perceive us and perceive themselves. They need to understand that they cannot be a party to endangering U.S. soldiers' lives and American interests. As they have before, that is going to end." According to the intel, Iranian officers were on the ground directly training, financing, arming, and supplying hostile militias in Iraq. They were responsible for killing scores of American troops. So the following months, the U.S. military established Task Force 17. TF-17 brought together operators from Delta Force SEALs and Rangers to track down Iranian military and intelligence officers from the Quds Force. These are the guys that were in Iraq to support hostile military groups. U.S. intelligence estimated there were around 150 Iranian operatives in Iraq at any given time, many of them from the Quds Force, which is a branch of the Iranian military that specializes in unconventional warfare tactics. This is actually something I saw firsthand evidence of when we were in Iraq. I saw dudes get rolled up and arrested who were backed by Iranian money and training and had a ton of links to Iran. The US government pushed forward with the counter-Iranian strategy, stating that it wasn't an escalation at all, but merely self-defense. Secretly, the strategy unleashed US intelligence operatives against Iranian assets and agents in the conflict zone. Others in the intelligence community and State Department weren't so sure that the escalation was a good idea. Iraq and the US presence in the Middle East were still in a too fragile of a state to go picking fights with Iran. And US officials speaking anonymously said, quote, "This has little to do with Iraq. It's about pushing Iran's buttons." For the next few years, Task Force 17 apprehended multiple Iranian agents in Iraq, but they were only able to hold them for a day or two before political tensions with the Iraqi government forced them to be released. An Army Ranger who served as part of Task Force 17 describes the larger forces at play that constantly foiled their attempts, saying, quote, "TF-17 was very political. There were a lot of times when we detained a senior-level Quds operative who had a diplomatic passport. We'd get called and Maliki would shut down JSOC for a day and say, until he's in my compound, all JSOC operations are closed, not just TF-17, all." And obviously General McChrystal would get pissed, and then I would have to drive some dickhead to the green zone and he'd get released for the day, end quote. To get around these political roadblocks, Joint Special Operations Command brought out the quote-unquote Xbox. Besides being one of the greatest gaming consoles of all time, the Xbox was the name given to a creation made by Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. It was designed to look exactly like your typical run-of-the-mill insurgent bomb, but the idea was to make them a completely deniable weapon. A senior officer from the unit spoke anonymously about it, saying, quote, "You've got authority for military force against one by-name guy. You got to get positive ID and positive detonation in a place where you're not going to get collateral damage. For instance, smoke the guy while he's driving his Hilux pickup in an area that there's no US or coalition presence." Wow, guys, that is some cold-ass. A typical operation involved one of JSOC's most experienced reconnaissance operators surveilling a target for days to learn patterns and routines, and once the operator found an opening, they'd plant the Xbox on the target's car or somewhere else that they were likely to be alone and wait for the right moment to trigger the explosive. The attack was virtually untraceable. It made them perfect for covertly taking out sensitive targets, giving the insurgents a taste of their own medicine. In an interview with Canadian journalist and national security author Sean Naylor, a former JSOC senior officer said that the Xbox made its debut in other hotspots around the world. Oh my goodness, that's some scary shit right there. That's gonna make me think that whenever there's a bomb going off, that it is involved in some way with the US Special Forces. The Delta and SEAL operators had even gone through the trouble of replicating the telltale recipe of the most notorious bomb makers in the Middle East, giving the bomb quote-unquote fake fingerprints that pointed to particular insurgent suppliers. So this way, even if the device didn't go off and it made its way to an enemy forensics lab, there wouldn't be any sign of the bomb coming from American special ops teams. But why all the focus on the Middle East? Well, for starters, it holds over 50% of the world's proven oil reserves. It sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, making it a vital corridor for global trade and energy flow. There's something timeless and beautiful about the region and its culture. Bedouin tribes roam the landscape in much the same way they did generations ago. All the major religions trace their roots here, making the region feel like the spiritual crossroads of humanity as well. The Middle East has unfortunately long been marred in conflict. And one of the most brutal stories of all these conflicts comes to us from our next story that takes us deep into the shadows of Afghanistan, into a world of covert hunts, secret prisons, and deniable operations. Buried beneath the headlines of the war was a CIA-run program so quiet that most soldiers never even heard its name: Omega Teams. These were elite hunter-killer units with a singular mission: track down the world's most wanted terrorists. International borders didn't stop them, and neither did governments. After the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, the CIA did not slow down. No, they pivoted. Their new focus was Al-Qaeda's leadership, and to get them, they needed something that looked nothing like a conventional unit. So they created a front, a unit called the Afghan Combat Applications Group, or CAG, a name borrowed from Delta Force's own to keep things buried. But this wasn't Delta. These were Afghan militia fighters trained in secret by CIA paramilitary officers and special forces. They were recruited from tribal networks, paid in cash, cut loose behind enemy lines, and their headquarters? A forgotten brick factory outside Kabul, officially abandoned, unofficially transformed into a CIA compound known only as Eagle Base. From Eagle Base, the agency ran black ops, and something even darker, a prison that didn't officially exist. This wasn't a war for the headlines. This was a quiet one, the one fought in the dark. They employed these local fighters who had something they didn't, an intimate knowledge of the ethnic and geographic makeup of Afghanistan. These dudes could blend in and track terrorists that had gone deep underground and off the grid. They were exploding in membership to over 300, which was kind of getting out of hand. It was going past what the US military could comfortably have oversight on. No one wants a rogue unit in Afghanistan, so CIA paramilitary officers, they only had a limited number of guys to watch over this Afghan militia. So they called in the help of SEAL Team 6 and gave them oversight into some of these units, calling them subunits, Sub-Counterterrorism Pursuit Teams, or CTPTSs. What was controversial and really sort of ballsy was they went into neighboring Pakistan to hunt enemy down. Pakistan is considered a major non-NATO ally of the United States, but tons of wanted terrorists would slip across the border into the loosely controlled tribal regions of Pakistan. CIA officers needed a way to deny the Taliban a hiding spot, but at the same time not antagonize the allied governments of Pakistan. This is a problem that militaries frequently run into, where they'll be fighting a war in one country officially, and then they will take advantage and use another country as a kind of safe spot. You can't touch me here. However, the decision to keep this unit secret was a risk. If Pakistan found out that they were operating on their soil, it would cause all kinds of international problems. By 2005, the quote-unquote Ultra teams were codified into actual policy as the Omega program. The overall program was so secretive that the members of the elite Afghan fighters didn't even know they were operating under the command of the CIA. The intercepted reports in 2020 showed that the American officers attached to the national strike units and told the militia fighters, "We work for the Afghan government." The overall force structure of the Omega teams had about 150 Afghan militia and around a dozen CIA and JSOC soldiers to provide intelligence and specialized combat skills. There were 8 Omega teams in total, operating out of key locations throughout Afghanistan. These teams conducted capture or kill missions against high-value targets. An important reason for this is because the CIA and Special Forces operate under different legal authorities. SF guys are often under Title 10, which has less scrutiny and needs less justification. Meanwhile, the CIA operates under what's called Title 50 authority, which is deniable covert operations, that the US government will authorize but disavow any knowledge of. This kind of partnership of putting SF guys under assignments on deniable Title 50 missions is known as a legal loophole called sheep dipping, which sounds like something you would do to a lady of the night, but in the espionage community, it allows active duty soldiers to work as paramilitary contractors for the intelligence agency. It essentially combines the two legal authorities into one big legal blank check. A senior official within the Department of Defense once commented anonymously, "The Omega contingent provided incredible capability to the overall effort. It made a really good program into a great one." And we know that a large portion of the prisoners that ended up at the black sites, like Guantanamo Bay and other terrorism holding facilities, were nabbed by these Omega teams. It's credited with providing the intelligence that led to the fatal drone strike against Adam Gaddan, who was an American citizen who joined Al-Qaeda sometime back in the mid-2000s and became a crucial part of the terrorist network's propaganda. Investigative journalists and human rights organizations have called the Omega teams unregulated death squads, operating with insufficient oversight and enabling local warlords to retaliate against whoever they wish, with the blessings of the CIA. According to a report from The Intercept, the National Strike Units of Afghani militia totaled up to 7,000 members. During the hasty U.S. withdrawal from the country, the CIA arranged priority evacuation flights and asylum for these paramilitaries and their families to avoid revenge from the many enemies that they might have made over the years, and to prevent some operational secrets from falling into the hands of the Taliban. The story of the Omega program doesn't fully end just there though. The CIA and JSOC liked the program so much that they apparently modeled similar teams after them in Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and many other hotspots in the Middle East and Africa. Exactly how many of these teams are operating around the world at any given time right now is something we may never know. The CIA wasn't the only US agency with a history of covert operations in Afghanistan. You might be surprised, as I was, to learn that the American DEA agency, the Drug Enforcement Agency, had tactical teams pulling triggers overseas. This next story is about the illicit substance trade in the country of Afghanistan. An estimated 90% of the world's heroin supply comes from Afghanistan. The opium trade accounted for around $4 billion worth of income that year. Even though the Taliban isn't down with it, Al-Qaeda certainly was. After 2001, the drug trade became one of the top sources of income for terrorist groups in the region. In 2003, the US Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, reopened their office in Kabul, growing their assigned staff to 97 by 2013. Yes, things were getting freaking wacky now. The DEA had boots on the ground in Afghanistan. Every alphabet soup, three-letter agency wanted a piece of this war. So DEA agents wanted to apply their expertise to help the Afghan government to train them to kill the drug trade. At that time, the DEA also employed a little-known unit called the Foreign Deployed Advisory and Support, or FAST team. It was like their version of a foreign SWAT team, kinda. They were a paramilitary unit in everything but name. These guys were armed with M4s, they had night vision, tactical gear, and the authority to conduct kinetic raids or killer capture missions alongside active military special forces. Each DEA FAST team had about 10 highly trained DEA agents who were often former SF soldiers themselves. Yes, things are getting even weirder. We're now doing the war on drugs and the war on terror combined. Cutting Al-Qaeda off from a major source of financial backing while improving stability were critical objectives for the US mission. It's more bizarre than it sounds, I promise you. It gets even weirder. From the partnership grew the National Interdiction Unit, which was basically the police SWAT team for the Afghanis and numbered about 100 strong. They went undercover to infiltrate the drug labs and smuggling networks of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The unit was immensely successful, but they kept a low profile. They destroyed 25 drug labs in 2009, plus they seized a total of something like 25,000 kilograms of opium and a ton of heroin. It was often heavily armed terrorists guarding their drug sources, but the DEA's FAST teams were actually officially disbanded in March 2017 after they were involved in some pretty bad incidents that you can look up. It's a little off topic for this video. They were the most controversial special forces law enforcement unit ever. I mean, the DEA still has agencies and agents all around the world in different countries, like in Mexico, but usually they're heavily restricted in what they can do, if they can even carry weapons. So our next story takes us to Syria in 2017, in the fight against ISIS. It was the largest US air assault behind enemy lines during the entire war, and it barely even made headlines. In January 2017, US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces fought alongside Green Berets from the 5th Special Forces Group, and they were closing in on a key ISIS stronghold, the strategic city of Tabuk, just 40 kilometers from Raqqa. At this point, ISIS was on the run. They'd lost ground in Iraq after the brutal Battle of Mosul, but in Syria they still controlled critical territory, including the Tabuk Dam. It's the largest dam in the entire country, and it's just this gigantic, towering, 18-story tall building. But it could have been turned into a devastating weapon because ISIS had fortified the dam with hundreds of gunmen, and they threatened to blow the floodgates if they were attacked. This wasn't an empty threat either. The United Nations warned that if the dam collapsed, dozens of villages downstream could be flooded, displacing or killing thousands of people. If the US called in airstrikes, they risked damaging the dam and causing the same disaster. By March, it was clear that a direct assault was necessary. So after weeks of probing operations, including amphibious reconnaissance missions across the Euphrates by Green Berets, supported by satellite and drone intelligence, the US-backed forces launched a daring air assault on March 22, 2017. It was intense to say the least. Dozens of Ospreys ferried over 500 US special operators and 1,000 SDF fighters across Lake Assad and the Euphrates River in a deep flanking maneuver. They struck ISIS from the south behind enemy lines in what was described as a shock and awe air assault, designed to prevent the enemy from sabotaging the dam. This was a crazy solution to the dam problem. As soon as the American Special Forces and SDF teams were on the ground on the other side of the dam, US Marines fired M777 howitzers, pounding ISIS positions from miles away with 155 shells. Apache gunships and airstrikes provided overhead cover, while Green Berets moved in on foot alongside SDF allies. This operation cut off a major ISIS supply route, that highway that links Aleppo to Deir ez-Zor, and it began breaking ISIS defense from within. But ISIS wasn't finished yet. After 2 days of fighting, they still were dug in. Then something terrifying happened. The Tabak Dam became inoperable. ISIS blamed US airstrikes, and they weren't entirely wrong either. The US had dropped 3 2,000-pound bombs on enemy positions at the dam, one of which failed to detonate. The damage jammed the floodgates, and there was a tentative ceasefire that was called while US engineers rushed in to assess the structure and to conduct emergency repairs, all under the threat of ambush and collapse. While the ceasefire held, ISIS used this lull to sneak in 900 reinforcements on March 28th. The fight wasn't over. The final push came on May 10th, when US Special Forces and SDF's troops launched a clearing operation to root out the last defenders. So US Air Force Colonel John Dorian put it bluntly: Tabak is an extremely dangerous battle zone. The Syrian Democratic Forces are facing ISIS snipers, using apartment buildings, hospitals, and mosques to hide in dense urban terrain. They barricaded themselves inside the dam's control room, using tunnels. They had no food, water, or communications that were entirely jammed, so eventually they surrendered or fled. The dam was secured, and the road to Raqqa was now open. Colonel Joseph Zakaria later explained, "This is the first time we've conducted an air assault with the Syrian Democratic Forces. We believe there are foreign fighters in there, probably in the hundreds, and they're facing a heavy fight, and that's what makes this operation so daring. I think we're lucky to catch ISIS by surprise." The SDF deserve huge credit for this mission. I didn't focus on them because this is about US Black Ops, but they led the frontline fight and held the ground. Moving over to Iraq for our next story, the CIA was heavily involved in the first Gulf War back when the United States, like usual, was trying to depose Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. But they didn't want to use the messy, overt military force to do it. Operation Desert Storm hadn't gone as far as regime change in Iraq, but the CIA was still instructed to find ways to exploit sectarian tensions within the country to weaken or topple Hussein's rule. In 1992, the agency found the perfect guy, al-Wali, who was an Iraqi politician that was living in exile in the United Kingdom. Al-Wali had a ton of people who were sympathetic to him within Saddam's military back home in Iraq. So the CIA recruited al-Wali and gained an entire network of covert assets in Iraq. Al-Wali formed the Iraqi National Accord and now had full CIA backing. Al-Wali's INA started an insurgent campaign of their own against Saddam. These guys planted car bombs and sabotaged government facilities. Their goal was to destabilize the regime. CIA agents helped the INA smuggle in explosives from northern Iraq into Baghdad. They then gathered intelligence that both the United States and al-Wali could use against Saddam. The INA channeled intelligence about Iraq's chemical and biological weapons program, including a claim passed to the British spy agency MI6 that Saddam could deploy weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. But at the time, it appeared like America was cultivating a promising network of spies and revolutionaries that could strike at the heart of Baghdad. The CIA didn't have the means within Iraq to verify how effective the INA bombing campaign was at damaging Saddam's rule, but by 1996, Awali and the CIA were ready for a full-on balls-to-the-wall coup. The operation was codenamed Achilles. The CIA station chief in neighboring Jordan requested air support from the United States to back the INA coup and the military defectors that would move against Saddam. But the US air support never came. The CIA station chief resigned in protest, and the coup attempt failed pretty hard. Saddam and his own agents working behind the scenes had his network infiltrate the INA, so he had 200 military officers arrested and 80 were executed for ties to the coup plot. Awali himself would actually assume political leadership of Iraq as the prime minister of the interim government after the overthrowing of Saddam, and then he was elected as the vice president of Iraq in 2014 and 2016. So holy crap, that is some serious lore to the Iraqi war. This next story also has to do with Iran. Operation Merlin was a plot by the CIA to set Iranian nuclear scientists down a false lead. The plan was first drawn up in the early 1990s under the Clinton administration, but was actually launched in February of 2000 under the George W. Bush presidency. The mission involved a Russian nuclear scientist who'd been defected to the US years earlier and was now on the CIA's payroll. The Russian scientist was given blueprints for the TBA-480 high voltage block, which is commonly known as a firing set in the nuke world. The device controlled the detonation sequence for the explosive blocks that would force a plutonium core to implode, and the CIA believed that it was one of the main gizmos that Iranian engineers hadn't figured out yet to make a functional warhead. The Russian scientist was immediately suspicious though. Why would the US willingly give away the blueprints for such a device to one of their main adversaries? When he looked at the plans, he could tell right away that the plans were fake and that the device wouldn't work. When he told the CIA handler that the blueprints were flawed and that Iranian engineers would pick up on it almost immediately and as quickly as he had, his handler told him everything had been accounted for and to simply go ahead with the operation. Unconvinced but not willing to disobey direct orders, the Russian scientists traveled to a scientific conference in Vienna where Iranian nuclear scientists would also be in attendance. Worried that the blueprints were so obviously flawed that his cover would be blown as soon as he handed the plans over to the Iranian scientists, the Russians slipped a note into the envelope, warning them that the blueprints were imperfect, but that he could fix them if they wanted. The Iranians would get the fake plans that the CIA wanted delivered, and his cover story of a greedy yet unemployed Russian scientist looking for the highest bidder would still be intact. The plan worked, sort of. The Russian delivered the envelope to the Iranian delegation, and the National Security Agency reported just days later that one of the Iranian officials had changed his entire schedule and booked an immediate flight back to Tehran. Seemed like the Iranians had taken the bait. But in the coming years, there were no reports of Iran's nuclear program rushing to build the design, only to fizzle out during testing. What the CIA had apparently failed to account for was that Iran already had a large body of knowledge thanks to the information fed to them from Pakistani nuclear scientists years earlier, along with their own work. The CIA had underestimated the talent of Iran's nuclear engineers, and the whole plan may have backfired, actually advancing Iran's nuclear program instead of derailing it. Under this theory, Iran's engineers quickly identified the flaw in the plans even without the Russian scientist's letter, then compared the blueprints to similar designs they already knew would work, filling in gaps in their knowledge without having to go through lengthy prototyping and testing phases. Exactly what happened once the plan made it to Tehran still hasn't been declassified, but the whole debacle was such a scandal within the CIA that former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling went public with the details, speaking to both the Senate Intelligence Committee as a whistleblower and to the New York Times reporter James Risen as an anonymous source. But Sterling's communication with Risen were intercepted by the federal government, and the former CIA officer was arrested on January 6, 2011, and charged with mishandling classified information under the Espionage Act. Operating far behind enemy lines in their mountainous north A joint force of CIA paramilitary officers, special forces, and thousands of Kurdish fighters quietly laid the groundwork for one of the most strategic and overlooked campaigns of the war. The Kurds, which is an ethnic group spread across Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, have long dreamed of an independent homeland, but their struggle has often been met with brutal repression. Under Saddam Hussein, this meant chemical warfare, where they were gassed, and in 1988, they killed 5,000 of them. These guys obviously hated Saddam and were eager to help the United States overthrow Saddam's dictatorship in 2003. Turkey, a NATO member and a key staging ally in the Middle East, even characterizes this group as terrorists. So any US involvement with the Peshmerga had to be kept under wraps until at least the situation in Iraq was under control. In the weeks leading up to the launch of the Operation Iraqi Freedom, small teams of CIA paramilitary officers, along with special forces, inserted into northern Iraq and linked up with the Kurdish fighters there. The CIA and SF teams gathered intel for the coming ground operation, and they had trained with the Kurds. Despite their common enemy, the Kurdish forces were split by a bitter rivalry between the KDP and the PUK factions. This meant that the CIA officers not only had to survive for months behind enemy lines, but also act as a kind of mediator between the Pentagon, the rival Kurdish factions all at once. They were the world's most deadly peer mediators ever. They moved unseen through the rugged terrain of northern Iraq, assessing the enemy forces and paving the way for Task Force Viking, which was the responsible force for invading from the north. Their job was to prevent Iraqi forces from reinforcing Baghdad or joining the main fight to the south. When the invasion kicked off, the Iraqi army had no idea there were already covert American troops in their midst. They struck the Iraqi units without warning from multiple directions as soon as the invasion kicked off in 2003. This left them vulnerable when the rest of Task Force Viking swept through the country. But the job wasn't easy. During the Battle of Debreka Pass, the US and the Peshmerga forces met stiff resistance from the Iraqi defenders that counterattacked with tanks and mechanized troops. They deployed T-55s and anti-aircraft guns that were more than capable of shredding infantry in the open. The American operators were without armor, so the US Peshmerga contingent had to work together to defeat the Iraqi counterattack. The Peshmerga assaulted Iraqi bunkers and mortar positions, while the US soldiers fired javelin-guided missiles and called in precision airstrikes. But the first airstrike missed and hit friendly forces. The 1,000-pound GBU-16 almost ended the battle right there. It killed 18 Peshmerga fighters and wounded another 45, along with 4 US Green Berets. The other Special Forces teams broke off from their advance and pushed to the scene of the friendly fire incident to provide medical aid to the wounded, both American and Kurdish alike. One of the Iraqi T-55 tanks tried to press the advantage and drove forward amidst the chaos, but it caught a javelin missile straight to the teeth from one of the Green Berets covering the area. 2 F-18s arrived on scene to finish off the remaining Iraqi tanks with bombing runs. The enemy forces were suppressed, and the Americans and the Kurds pushed forward together, securing the crossroads against all odds. While the Green Berets and Peshmerga did most of the fighting, sources say there were at least 2 military intelligence operators present during the battle. The world of US Black Ops in the Middle East is a shadow realm, filled with guys who don't technically exist, working in units that aren't on paper. These operations weren't just battles, they were experiments in a new kind of warfare that blurred the line between tinker, sailor, soldier, spy, and contractor. But now, after trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives, and an entire region reshaped, the question isn't just what happened in the shadows, but why did that just happen? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Go to www.cappyarmy.com for full show notes and sources and links to exclusive editions.